The call came at 2:47 in the morning on October 15, 1995, piercing through the autumn silence of Cedar Falls, Iowa. Margaret Hutchinson had been a midwife for 23 years, and she knew the sound of desperation when she heard it. The voice on the other end was young, scared and barely above a whisper. "Please," the girl said, "I need help. I can't go to the hospital." If you've ever witnessed someone disappear from your life without explanation, leaving only questions that echo through the years, you understand how some stories refuse to stay buried. Consider sharing this with someone who might remember when hope felt fragile and truth seemed impossible to find. Margaret pulled on her worn leather jacket and grabbed her medical bag, the same black leather satchel her grandmother had carried through the Nebraska farmlands in the 1940s. The address led her to the outskirts of town, where the streetlights gave way to gravel roads and mailboxes stood like silent sentinels in the darkness. The October air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of winter, and Margaret's breath formed small clouds as she walked up the narrow path to a small rental house with peeling white paint and a porch light that flickered intermittently. Inside, she found 17-year-old Rebecca Morrison, curled on a second-hand couch that had seen better decades. The girl's dark hair was damp with perspiration, and her eyes held the kind of fear that comes not from physical pain, but from a future that seems impossibly uncertain. Beside her sat an older woman Margaret didn't recognize, mid-40s, with careful makeup despite the late hour, and hands that trembled slightly as she smoothed Rebecca's hair. "This is my aunt, Patricia," Rebecca managed between contractions. "She drove up from Des Moines when I called." Patricia Morrison nodded curtly at Margaret, her lips pressed into a thin line. There was something in her expression, a mixture of determination and barely contained panic, that made Margaret pause. In her years of practice, she had learned to read the spaces between words, the tension that hung in rooms where secrets lived. This felt different from the usual teenage pregnancy scenarios she had encountered. The labor progressed through the night, with the autumn wind rattling the windows and the distant sound of trains carrying their cargo east toward Chicago. Margaret worked with practiced efficiency, her hands steady and sure as she guided new life into the world. At 5:33 a.m., as the first hint of dawn touched the horizon, Rebecca delivered a healthy baby girl, 6 pounds, 4 ounces, with dark hair like her mother's, and lungs that announced her arrival with impressive vigor. But instead of the usual tears of joy and relief, an odd silence settled over the small living room. Patricia took the baby immediately, wrapping her in a yellow blanket that looked new, purchased specifically for this moment. Rebecca turned her face toward the wall, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than exhaustion. "What's her name?" Margaret asked, as she always did, preparing to fill out the birth records. Patricia answered quickly, "Emma. Emma Claire." Margaret noticed that Rebecca didn't respond, didn't even look at her daughter. In 23 years, she had never seen a new mother turn away like that, as if the sight of her own child caused physical pain. Something was happening here that went beyond the usual complications of young motherhood. Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself thinking about that night more often than usual. She had left her contact information, as she always did, but Rebecca never called. When Margaret drove past the rental house a month later, it stood empty, with a "for rent" sign swaying in the November wind. Neighbors mentioned that the girl and her aunt had left town suddenly, taking very little with them. It wasn't until 18 years later, in the autumn of 2013, that Margaret would understand the true weight of what she had witnessed that October night. By then, she was 71 years old, her hands marked by age spots and arthritis, her medical bag retired to a closet in her Cedar Falls home. She had delivered over 3,000 babies in her career, but she had never forgotten the girl who wouldn't look at her own daughter, and the aunt whose hands had trembled as she held baby Emma like a precious secret. The truth, when it finally surfaced, would shake the foundations of what Margaret thought she knew about that night and force her to confront a choice she had unknowingly made in the darkness of an October dawn, a choice that had shaped the lives of people she would never see again. Margaret Hutchinson's retirement had settled around her like an old quilt, comfortable and familiar, filled with the quiet rhythms of a life well lived. Her days began with coffee on the front porch of her Victorian home on Elm Street, watching the neighborhood children walk to school with backpacks bouncing against their small shoulders. The maple tree in her yard had grown thick and tall over the decades, its branches now reaching toward her bedroom window like old friends offering shade on summer mornings. She had thought the memories would fade with time, but certain cases lingered in her mind with stubborn clarity. The Morrison girl was one of them. Margaret could still recall the exact texture of the yellow blanket Patricia had brought, the way the porch light had cast shadows across Rebecca's young face, the sound of the baby's first cry cutting through the pre-dawn silence. These details had a weight to them, as if they carried more significance than she had understood at the time. In the 18 years since that October night, Margaret had tried several times to locate Rebecca. She had searched phone directories, asked longtime residents if they remembered the family, even visited the Cedar Falls Library to look through old high school yearbooks. Rebecca Morrison seemed to have vanished as completely as morning mist, taking baby Emma with her into whatever new life they had built beyond the borders of Iowa. The house where Emma had been born had changed hands 3 times since then. The current owners, a young couple with twin boys, had painted over the peeling white exterior with cheerful yellow siding and planted flower boxes under the windows. Sometimes, when Margaret drove past on her way to the grocery store, she wondered if the walls still held echoes of that night. The sound of Rebecca's labored breathing, the creak of old floorboards under Patricia's pacing feet, the soft murmur of Margaret's voice guiding a new life into the world. Margaret's own life had continued its steady course. She had attended church potlucks and baby showers, watched her neighbors, children graduate from high school and leave for college, tended her garden with the patience that comes from understanding how long good things take to grow. Her sister visited from Nebraska every summer, bringing homemade pies and gossip from their childhood town. But even those familiar conversations felt incomplete somehow, as if Margaret carried a story she couldn't quite bring herself to tell. The first hint that the Morrison case might resurface came on a Tuesday morning in September 2013, when Detective Ray Kowalski appeared at Margaret's front door with a thermos of coffee and a kind of expression that suggested he had been thinking about something for a long time. Ray was in his 40s now, with silver threading through his dark hair and reading glasses that he wore pushed up on his forehead like a second pair of eyes. He had been a rookie patrol officer back in 1995, and Margaret had known his family since he was a boy, riding his bicycle through the neighborhood with a baseball card close-pinned to the spokes. "Morning, Margaret," he said, settling into one of her porch chairs with the easy familiarity of someone who belonged there. "I was hoping we could talk about something. A case from way back." Margaret poured herself a fresh cup of coffee and waited. Ray had always been the kind of person who took his time getting to the point, circling around difficult subjects like a cat approaching something that might or might not be dangerous. "You remember delivering babies for folks who didn't want to go through the hospital?" he asked finally. "Of course. Plenty of families preferred home births back then. Still do, some of them. What about families who had other reasons for avoiding hospitals? Documentation reasons?" Margaret set down her coffee cup carefully. She had wondered, over the years, if this conversation would eventually come. "Ray, you know I can't discuss specific cases. Patient confidentiality doesn't end just because time passes." "I understand that. But Margaret, we've got a situation that's been cold for 18 years, and it's heating up again. A missing baby case from 1995. The family finally came forward, and they're asking questions that we can't answer without help." The October morning suddenly felt colder, despite the sunshine filtering through the maple leaves. Margaret pulled her cardigan closer around her shoulders and thought about Rebecca Morrison's face, the way she had turned toward the wall instead of reaching for her newborn daughter. "Tell me about the case," she said quietly. Ray opened a manila folder that he had been carrying under his arm. Inside were photographs, documents, and what looked like handwritten notes spanning nearly 2 decades. Baby girl, born sometime in mid-October 1995. Parents reported her missing from their home, claimed she was taken during the night. But the timeline never quite added up, and there were inconsistencies in their statements. The case went cold pretty quickly. He handed Margaret a photograph, a young couple standing in front of a Christmas tree, the woman holding a tiny pink dress, the man's arm around her shoulders in a gesture that spoke of shared grief and stubborn hope. Margaret studied their faces, looking for some spark of recognition, but they were strangers to her. "The thing is," Ray continued, "we just got new information. Someone saw a birth certificate that was filed incorrectly, or filed under circumstances that didn't match what was reported at the time. It's got us looking at the case again, wondering if maybe the baby wasn't taken at all. Maybe she was born somewhere else, to someone else." Margaret felt the weight of 18 years settling across her shoulders like snow. She thought about Patricia Morrison's trembling hands, about the yellow blanket that had seemed too perfect, too prepared. She thought about Rebecca's tears and the way she had refused to look at her daughter, as if seeing Emma would make something too real to bear. "What are you asking me, Ray?" "I'm asking if you remember a birth around that time." "October 15th, maybe the 16th. A baby girl, born at home, delivered by a midwife who knew what she was doing." He leaned forward, his voice gentle but insistent. "Margaret, there's a family out there who's been looking for their daughter for 18 years. And there might be a young woman who's been living under a name that isn't really hers, not knowing that people are still waiting for her to come home." The maple leaves rustled overhead, and Margaret closed her eyes, letting herself remember that October night in all its complicated detail. Somewhere in Cedar Falls, or perhaps far beyond it, Emma Claire Morrison was now 18 years old, the same age her mother had been on the night she was born. She might be starting college, or working her first job, or falling in love with someone who had no idea that her very existence was wrapped in questions that had haunted strangers for nearly 2 decades. Margaret opened her eyes and met Ray's patient gaze. For the first time in 18 years, she began to speak about the night that had never quite left her memory, and the choice she was about to make that would change everything once again. The confession came slowly, like water seeping through a crack in a dam that had held for 18 years. Margaret sat on her front porch with Detective Kowalski, the manila folder spread between them like a bridge connecting past and present, and let the words find their own careful rhythm. Some truth, she had learned, couldn't be rushed. Her name was Rebecca Morrison. Margaret began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands as she reached for her coffee. 17 years old, scared out of her mind, the call came in the middle of the night, October 15th, 1995. I remember because it was the same day as my late husband's birthday, and I had been sitting up thinking about him instead of sleeping. Ray pulled out a small notebook, the kind detectives carried in their shirt pockets, worn smooth from years of use. But he didn't write anything down immediately. Instead, he listened with the patience that came from understanding that some stories needed space to breathe. The address was on Elm Creek Road, that little rental house that's been painted yellow now. When I got there, Rebecca was already in active labor, but she wasn't alone. There was an older woman with her, said she was an aunt, Patricia Morrison from Des Moines. Something about the whole situation felt careful. Planned, but not in the way you'd expect for a young girl having her first baby. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the porch floorboards. Margaret could hear the distant sound of children playing in the elementary school playground 6 blocks away, their laughter carrying on the autumn breeze like echoes from another lifetime. Rebecca delivered a healthy baby girl at 5:33 a.m. 6 pounds, 4 ounces, dark hair, perfect in every way. Margaret paused, remembering the weight of the infant in her hands, the way babies always seem to contain more possibility than their small bodies should be able to hold. But Rebecca wouldn't look at her. Not once. She turned her face to the wall and cried like her heart was breaking. Ray leaned forward slightly. "What about the aunt?" Patricia took the baby immediately, had a yellow blanket ready, store-bought, with the tag still attached. She held that little girl like she was made of spun glass, but there was something desperate about it, too. Like she knew she might not get to hold her for long. Margaret stood up and walked to the porch railing, looking out at the neighborhood that had changed so much over the decades, while somehow remaining exactly the same. The Morrison house was visible from here, just a glimpse of yellow siding through the trees, and she wondered if the current owners ever sensed the weight of what had happened within those walls. I asked about a name for the birth certificate. Patricia answered right away, Emma Claire. Rebecca still wouldn't speak, wouldn't even acknowledge that I was talking to her. In all my years as a midwife, I had never seen a new mother react that way. Did you file the birth certificate? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. This was the part of the story that had kept her awake on countless nights over the past 18 years. The decision that had seemed reasonable at the time, but had grown heavier with each passing season. Patricia said they would handle the paperwork themselves, said they had family connections in Des Moines who could expedite things. She paid me in cash, more than my usual fee, and asked me to keep the birth confidential. Said Rebecca was from a prominent family and they needed to protect her privacy. Ray nodded, making a note now. And you agreed to that? I thought I was protecting a scared teenager from gossip and judgment. Cedar Falls is a small town, Ray. Word gets around. I figured once they got settled wherever they were going, they'd file the proper documents, and everything would be legitimate. I had no reason to think. She trailed off, shaking her head. When did you realize something might be wrong? A month later, I drove past the house and it was empty. For rent sign in the yard, no forwarding address. I asked around, but nobody seemed to know where they had gone. It was like they had just vanished. The detective flipped through several pages in the folder, pulling out a photograph that he handed to Margaret. It showed a young woman around 17, with light brown hair and freckles scattered across her nose like constellations. She was smiling in the picture, but there was something tentative about her expression, as if she wasn't quite sure she deserved the happiness captured in that moment. "This is Sarah Chen," Ray said quietly. Her daughter was reported missing on October 16, 1995. Born October 15th at Cedar Falls General Hospital, but disappeared from the family home sometime during the night. Sarah and her husband David had been trying to have children for 7 years. This baby was their miracle. Margaret stared at the photograph, her heart dropping into the hollow space where certainty used to live. Sarah Chen had been 17 in 1995, the same age as Rebecca Morrison. But where Rebecca had been pale and slight, Sarah was Asian American, with the kind of delicate features that would have made her stand out in their predominantly white community. "How did you connect this to my case?" Margaret asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Birth certificates." Sarah's baby was never officially found, but about 6 months ago, a clerk in Des Moines noticed an irregularity in some old filings. A birth certificate for an Emma Claire Morrison, filed 3 months after the alleged birth date, with a midwife listed as the attending medical professional. But no midwife by that name was licensed in Iowa in 1995. Margaret felt the world tilt slightly, like a photograph being adjusted in a frame. What name did they put on the certificate? Margaret Henderson. Close enough to your name to be believable, different enough to avoid immediate detection. The implications settled around them like autumn leaves, soft at first, then accumulating into something that couldn't be ignored. Somewhere, a young woman named Emma Claire Morrison was living a life built on a foundation of deception, while a family named Chen had spent 18 years wondering what happened to their daughter. "Ray," Margaret said slowly, "I need you to understand something. That night I thought I was helping a teenage girl through a difficult situation. I never imagined that I might be, that's someone else's child. I know, Margaret, you were doing what you thought was right. But now we need to figure out what happened, and more importantly, we need to find Emma. Because if she's really Sarah Chen's daughter, then there are people who have been waiting 18 years to bring her home." Margaret sank back into her porch chair, feeling every one of her 71 years settling into her bones. In the distance, the school bell rang, marking the end of recess, and children's voices faded as they returned to their classrooms, to lessons about history and mathematics and other subjects that seemed simple compared to the tangled truth that had just reshaped everything she thought she knew about that October night in 1995. "Where do we start?" she asked. Ray closed the folder and stood up, straightening his jacket with the efficient movements of someone who had learned to carry difficult news with grace. "We start by finding Patricia Morrison, because I have a feeling she knows exactly where Emma is, and exactly who she really belongs to." The search for Patricia Morrison began in the basement archives of the Cedar Falls Public Library, where decades of local records had been carefully preserved in climate-controlled filing cabinets that smelled of old paper and patient time. Detective Kowalski had enlisted the help of Linda Martinez, the library's head librarian, whose reputation for finding needles in haystacks was legendary among local law enforcement. Margaret accompanied them on that first Tuesday morning in October, driving the familiar streets of her hometown with the strange sensation that she was seeing everything through different eyes. The cedar trees that gave the town its name were beginning to turn their autumn colors, and the air carried the crisp promise of winter weather still months away. It seemed impossible that the same October light that had illuminated Emma's birth 18 years ago was now shining on this search for truth. Linda had already pulled the relevant phone directories, voter registrations, and property records from 1995, spreading them across one of the library's large oak tables, like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. She was a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and the kind of methodical patience that made her invaluable in situations like this. "Patricia Morrison," she said, running her finger down a column of names. "I found 3 listings in Iowa for that year. One in Des Moines, which matches what you told Detective Kowalski, one in Iowa City, and one in Dubuque." Ray leaned over the table, studying the addresses. The Des Moines listing is for Patricia J. Morrison on Ingersoll Avenue. Age listed as 43 in 1995, which would make her about 61 now. "That fits," Margaret said, remembering the woman who had sat beside Rebecca that night, smoothing her hair with hands that had known how to comfort frightened girls. She seemed like she was in her 40s, well-dressed, the kind of person who was used to handling difficult situations. Linda had also pulled property records showing that Patricia J. Morrison had owned a house on Ingersoll Avenue from 1987 to 1996, selling it in March of 96, just 5 months after Emma's birth. The new owners were listed as James and Carol Whitfield, and according to the records, they still live there. "That's our starting point," Ray decided. "We'll drive down to Des Moines this afternoon and talk to the Whitfields. Maybe they remember something about Patricia, or have a forwarding address." The drive to Des Moines took them through the heart of Iowa's farm country, past cornfields that had been harvested down to stubble and farmhouses that sat like islands in seas of rich, dark soil. Margaret rode in the passenger seat of Ray's unmarked police car, watching the landscape roll past and thinking about all the ways a person could disappear in a country this vast and open. The Whitfield house on Ingersoll Avenue was a modest 2-story colonial with white siding and black shutters, the kind of home that suggested middle-class stability and careful maintenance over many years. Carol Whitfield met them at the front door, a woman in her 70s with gray hair pinned back in a neat bun, and the cautious expression of someone who rarely received unexpected visitors. "Detective Kowalski, Cedar Falls Police," Ray said, showing his badge. "We're hoping you might remember the previous owner of this house, Patricia Morrison. We're trying to locate her in connection with a missing persons case." Carol's expression shifted from caution to concern. "Oh my, well, please come in. I remember Patricia quite well. We bought the house from her in 1996, but we had met her several times during the negotiation process. The living room was decorated with family photographs and comfortable furniture that spoke of decades of quiet contentment." James Whitfield emerged from what looked like a home office, a tall man with a beard that had gone completely white, wearing the kind of cardigan that suggested retirement filled with crossword puzzles and afternoon naps. "Patricia Morrison," James said, settling into his recliner. "She was in quite a hurry to sell, as I recall. Needed to move quickly for family reasons," she said. "Nice woman, very organized, but there was something—" He paused, searching for the right word. "Something stressful about the whole situation. Like she was dealing with more than just a regular move." Carol nodded in agreement. "She had a young woman with her during one of the showings. Very quiet, very pale. Patricia introduced her as her niece. Said she was helping her get settled in a new state after some family difficulties. The girl barely spoke, just sat in the car mostly, while Patricia handled the business details." Margaret felt her breath catch. "Do you remember what the niece looked like?" "Dark hair, quite young, maybe 18 or 19. Patricia seemed very protective of her, kept checking to make sure she was all right. I got the impression that the move was as much for the niece's benefit as Patricia's own." Ray leaned forward. "Did Patricia mention where they were moving to?" "She said something about Colorado. Denver, I think, or maybe Colorado Springs. She had family connections out there. Or business connections. I'm sorry, it's been so many years, and we only met with her a few times." James stood up and walked to a bookshelf, returning with a small address book that looked like it had been well used over the decades. "You know, we exchanged Christmas cards for a few years after the sale. Let me see if I still have her forwarding address." He flipped through pages filled with careful handwriting, the accumulated contacts of a lifetime of friendships and professional relationships. "Here we are. Patricia Morrison, 1247 Pine Valley Drive, Colorado Springs, Colorado." But this would be from 1996, so who knows if it's still current. Ray copied the address into his notebook, while Margaret tried to imagine Patricia and Rebecca, now calling themselves aunt and niece, starting over in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, carrying baby Emma into a new life built on secrets and careful lies. "Did she ever mention the baby?" Margaret asked quietly. Carol and James exchanged a glance. "There was a baby," Carol said slowly. "Patricia brought her to one of the final meetings, actually. Tiny thing, couldn't have been more than a few months old. Patricia said it was her grandniece, that she was helping raise her while the girl, Rebecca, I think her name was, got back on her feet. Beautiful baby, James added. Dark hair, big eyes. Patricia doted on her, carried her everywhere in one of those baby carriers. You could tell she was completely devoted to that little girl. On the drive back to Cedar Falls, Margaret stared out the window at the familiar Iowa landscape and tried to reconcile the Patricia Morrison she was learning about with the woman she had met that October night. Every new detail painted a picture of someone who had planned carefully, who had been prepared to take on the responsibility of raising a child that might not have been hers to raise. She loved that baby, Margaret said finally. Whatever else happened, whatever lies were told, Patricia Morrison loved Emma like her own granddaughter. Ray nodded, navigating the evening traffic as they approached Cedar Falls. The question is, did she know Emma wasn't Rebecca's baby to begin with, or was she just as deceived as everyone else? As they pulled into Margaret's driveway, the porch light glowing like a beacon in the gathering darkness, Margaret realized that the answers they were seeking would require them to travel much farther than Des Moines. Colorado Springs was 800 miles away, and Emma Morrison, if that was really her name, was now 18 years old, possibly living a life that had no connection to the questions that had brought them this far. But somewhere in Colorado, or perhaps somewhere else entirely, Sarah and David Chen's daughter was growing up under a name that wasn't her own, loved by people who may or may not have known the truth about how she came to be part of their family. The October light fading outside Margaret's kitchen window seemed to whisper with all the secrets that 24 hours could change and all the years it might take to set things right. The flight to Colorado Springs gave Margaret her first view of the Rocky Mountains, their snow-capped peaks rising from the plains like ancient promises carved in stone. She pressed her face to the airplane window, watching the landscape transform from the familiar flatness of Iowa to something more dramatic and vertical, and wondered if this was how Rebecca Morrison had felt 18 years ago, suspended between one life and another, carrying secrets that grew heavier with altitude. Detective Kowalski had arranged for cooperation from the Colorado Springs Police Department, and they were met at the airport by Detective Maria Santos, a woman in her 30s with kind eyes and the sort of patient demeanor that suggested she understood how complicated family mysteries could become. The drive from the airport took them through neighborhoods that had clearly grown and changed over the past 2 decades, with new housing developments spreading toward the mountains like fingers reaching for something just beyond their grasp. Pine Valley Drive was located in an older section of the city where the houses had been built in the 1970s and 1980s, with large yards and mature trees that provided shade during the intense mountain summers. Number 1247 was a ranch-style home with a red brick facade and a front garden that had been carefully tended over many years. The mailbox bore the name Morrison, and Margaret felt her heart skip with the recognition that they had found the right place. Patricia Morrison answered the door after the third knock, and Margaret almost didn't recognize her. The woman who had seemed so controlled and composed 18 years ago now appeared smaller somehow, her dark hair gone completely gray and pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore a faded denim shirt and gardening gloves, and there was dirt under her fingernails that spoke of afternoons spent coaxing flowers from Colorado soil. "Yes?" she said, looking from Detective Santos to Detective Kowalski to Margaret with the cautious expression of someone who had been expecting this moment for a very long time. "Ms. Morrison, I'm Detective Santos with Colorado Springs PD. This is Detective Kowalski from Iowa and Margaret Hutchinson. We'd like to talk with you about events that took place in Cedar Falls in October of 1995. Patricia's face went very still, like water before it freezes. She looked directly at Margaret for the first time, and recognition flickered in her eyes, a mix of surprise and something that might have been relief. "The midwife," she said quietly. "I wondered if you would ever come." She stepped back from the doorway, inviting them into a living room that was comfortable and lived in, with bookshelves lining the walls and photographs covering every available surface. Margaret found herself scanning the pictures automatically, looking for glimpses of Rebecca and Emma in the accumulated visual history of this Colorado family. "Would you like some coffee?" Patricia asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "I was just working in the garden, but I can put on a pot." "That would be fine," Detective Santos said, settling into a chair that faced the window overlooking the backyard. "We appreciate you talking with us." While Patricia busied herself in the kitchen, Margaret studied the photographs more carefully. There were pictures of graduations and birthday parties, Christmas mornings and summer vacations, but they seemed to begin around 1996, as if this family's documented history had started the year after Emma's birth. In several of the more recent photos, she spotted a young woman who looked to be in her late teens, with dark hair and delicate features that seemed familiar despite the years that had passed. Patricia returned with a tray of coffee cups and a plate of homemade cookies that smelled like vanilla and cinnamon. She served everyone with the careful politeness of someone who was buying time to organize her thoughts, then sat down in the chair closest to the photographs, as if drawing strength from the visual reminders of the life she had built here. "I suppose you want to know about Rebecca and the baby," she said, looking directly at Margaret. "About that night in Cedar Falls. We want to know about Emma," Detective Kowalski said gently. "We want to know who she really is." Patricia was quiet for a long moment, her coffee cup cradled in both hands like she was trying to absorb its warmth. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of 18 years of carefully guarded secrets. "Rebecca Morrison was my sister's daughter," she began. "My sister died when Rebecca was 15, and she came to live with me in Des Moines. She was a good girl, but she was angry about losing her mother, and she made some poor choices. Got involved with an older boy who didn't treat her well." Margaret nodded, remembering the frightened teenager who had turned away from her own newborn child. When Rebecca found out she was pregnant, she was terrified. Not just of being a young mother, but of what it would mean for the baby to have a father like that. She begged me to help her find a way to give the child a better life. "So you arranged for a private adoption?" Detective Santos asked. Patricia shook her head. "It was more complicated than that. Rebecca had heard about a family in Cedar Falls who had lost a baby. A couple named Chin, who had been trying for years to have children, and their daughter had been—" She paused, looking uncomfortable. "There had been some kind of tragedy involving their baby. Rebecca got it into her head that maybe God intended for her baby to replace the one they had lost." Margaret felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting in her mind, forming a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than anything she had imagined. "Patricia, are you telling us that Rebecca knew about the Chen baby when she gave birth?" "Not exactly knew. She had heard rumors, gossip around town. She was convinced that her baby was meant to fill the hole left by their loss. She made me promise that we would find a way to make that happen." Detective Kowalski leaned forward. "But that's not what happened." Patricia's composure finally cracked and tears began to slide down her cheeks. "I couldn't do it. When I held that beautiful baby girl in my arms, when I saw how much Rebecca was hurting, when I realized what we would be taking away from the Chen family, I couldn't give Emma to strangers, even if they were the people who had lost their own child." The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. Outside the window, Margaret could see a tire swing hanging from an old oak tree, and she wondered how many afternoons Emma Morrison had spent there, pumping her legs toward the Colorado sky, while the adults who raised her carried this enormous secret. "So you kept her," Margaret said. "You and Rebecca raised Emma yourselves." "Rebecca tried, for about 2 years, but she was so young, and the guilt was eating her alive. She knew we had Emma under false pretenses, knew there were people somewhere who might be looking for a baby girl, born in October 1995. Eventually, she couldn't handle it anymore. She signed legal custody over to me and left for California. I haven't seen her since 2000. Detective Santos made notes while Patricia wiped her tears with a tissue that she had pulled from her pocket. "And Emma? Does she know any of this?" "She knows that Rebecca is her birth mother, and that she left when Emma was small. She knows that I adopted her legally when she was 3 years old, and that her birth father was never involved. But she doesn't know about—" Patricia gestured helplessly toward the detectives. "About any of this other business." "Where is Emma now?" Margaret asked quietly. "She's a freshman at Colorado State University in Fort Collins, studying to be a teacher. She wants to work with elementary school children." Patricia's voice filled with pride despite the circumstances. "She's a wonderful girl, kind and smart and funny. She calls me every Sunday, sends me pictures of her dorm room and her new friends. She's everything I could have hoped for in a daughter." Margaret thought about Sarah and David Chen, who had spent 18 years wondering what happened to their own daughter, and felt the weight of all the love that had been divided and redirected by a single night's decisions. "Patricia," she said gently, There's something else you need to know. Something about the night Emma was born that we didn't understand until recently. Patricia set down her coffee cup and looked at Margaret with the expression of someone who had been waiting 18 years for the other shoe to drop. The Chin baby who went missing that night, Sarah and David's daughter, she was born at Cedar Falls General Hospital on October 15th, just a few hours before I delivered Emma at that rental house. We think there might have been some kind of mix-up or switch or... Patricia's face went completely white. Are you telling me that Emma isn't Rebecca's biological daughter? The silence that followed was profound, filled with the sound of everything Patricia Morrison thought she knew about her family crumbling like autumn leaves. Margaret watched as 18 years of certainty drained from the older woman's face, replaced by a terror that seemed to age her before their eyes. "We don't know for certain," Detective Santos said carefully, "but the timing, the circumstances, the fact that both babies were born within hours of each other in the same small town, we think it's possible that somehow the babies were switched." Patricia stood up abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked her carefully tended garden. Her hands were shaking as she gripped the windowsill, and Margaret could see her shoulders moving with the effort of trying to breathe normally. "That's impossible," Patricia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I was there. I saw Rebecca give birth. I held Emma from the moment she was born." "Patricia," Margaret said gently, "I need you to think very carefully about that night. Was there any time when you weren't watching the baby? Any moment when someone else could have had access to her?" Patricia turned back to face them, her face streaked with tears. "There was. After the birth, Rebecca was hemorrhaging slightly. You were focused on her, trying to make sure she was all right. I had taken the baby into the kitchen to clean her up and weigh her. I was gone for maybe 10 or 15 minutes. Was anyone else in the house?" Detective Kowalski asked. "No, just the three of us. But..." Patricia paused, a new realization dawning in her eyes. "The house next door. There were lights on, and I remember hearing a car in the driveway. I thought it was strange for that time of night, but I was so focused on Rebecca and the baby that I didn't really pay attention." Margaret felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. "Patricia, what if Rebecca wasn't the only young woman giving birth in that neighborhood that night? What if someone else had access to both babies?" The implications hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been smoldering for 18 years. Patricia sank back into her chair, looking older and more fragile than she had when they arrived. "If that's true," she whispered, "then Emma isn't just not Rebecca's daughter. She's someone else's daughter entirely. Someone who has been looking for her all this time." Detective Santos leaned forward. "We need to run DNA tests to know for sure. Would you be willing to provide a sample and to ask Emma to do the same?" Patricia nodded slowly, as if moving through water. "What happens if the tests confirm what you're suggesting? What happens to Emma? What happens to us?" "That depends on a lot of factors," Detective Kowalski said. "Emma is 18 now, legally an adult. She has the right to make her own decisions about contact with any biological family. And you've been her legal guardian for 15 years. That doesn't just disappear." Margaret watched Patricia Morrison grapple with the possibility that everything she had built her life around might be founded on a mistake that had torn apart two families and created a third from the pieces. In the photographs surrounding them, Emma's face smiled out from birthday parties and graduations, prom pictures, and family vacations. A young woman who had been loved and cherished by someone who might not have been meant to raise her at all. "There's something else," Patricia said quietly. "Something I never told Rebecca, or Emma, or anyone." She walked to a bookshelf in the corner and pulled out a photo album, flipping through pages until she found what she was looking for. She handed Margaret a photograph of baby Emma, maybe 3 or 4 months old, lying on a blanket in what looked like Patricia's backyard in Iowa. "Look at her eyes," Patricia said. Margaret studied the photograph carefully. Baby Emma's eyes were dark, almost black, with an almond shape that seemed familiar, but not in the way she had expected. "Patricia," Margaret said slowly, "Emma's eyes, they're not European, they look Asian." Patricia finished. "I always thought Emma looked different from Rebecca, but I told myself it was just because babies change so much as they grow. But looking at her now, as a young woman, Margaret, Emma Morrison has never looked like she could be Rebecca's biological daughter." The truth settled around them like winter shadows, cold and inescapable. Somewhere in Colorado, a young woman named Emma Morrison was studying to become a teacher, calling the woman who raised her every Sunday, building a life that was genuine and full of love, even if it was built on foundations that were about to shift beneath her feet. And somewhere else, Margaret didn't yet know where, Sarah and David Chen were continuing to live with a hole in their hearts, shaped like the daughter they had lost 18 years ago, never knowing that she was alive and well, and learning to change the world one elementary school student at a time. Emma Morrison was in her dorm room at Colorado State University, surrounded by psychology textbooks and the comfortable chaos of freshman year, when her phone rang with the call that would change everything. It was a Tuesday evening in late October, and she had been preparing for a midterm exam while her roommate Sarah practiced violin in the hallway, something that would have annoyed most people but that Emma found oddly soothing. She almost didn't answer when she saw Patricia's name on the caller ID. Their usual Sunday conversation had been just 3 days ago, and Patricia rarely called outside their established routine unless something was wrong. But something in Emma's chest, an intuition that had served her well throughout her 18 years, made her set down her highlighter and accept the call. "Hi, Mom," she said, using the name that had felt natural since she was 3 years old. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, longer than the usual beat of silence that came from Patricia gathering her thoughts. When her mother's voice came through the phone, it sounded different somehow. Older, more fragile, as if she were speaking from a great distance. "Emma, sweetheart, I need to talk to you about something important. Something about your family history that I've never told you before." Emma felt her stomach tighten with the instinctive dread that comes when the adults in your life suddenly sound serious in ways that suggest your world is about to change. She had always known that her family story was different, that her birth mother Rebecca had left when she was small, that Patricia had raised her alone with a devotion that seemed to contain traces of some deeper sadness. "What kind of family history?" Emma asked, closing her textbook and giving Patricia her full attention. "There are some people here from Iowa, honey. Police detectives and a woman named Margaret who was there when you were born. They have questions about that night, about circumstances that I didn't understand at the time." Emma's hand tightened on the phone. "Mom, you're scaring me." "What kind of questions?" Patricia's voice broke slightly as she tried to explain 18 years of secrets in words that wouldn't shatter her daughter's sense of who she was. "Emma, there's a possibility, just a possibility, that there was some kind of mistake when you were born. That Rebecca might not be your biological mother." The words hung in the air between Colorado and Iowa like a bridge that Emma wasn't sure she wanted to cross. Outside her dorm window, she could see other students walking across campus with backpacks and coffee cups, living normal Tuesday evening lives that suddenly seemed impossibly simple. "I don't understand," Emma said quietly. "How could there be a mistake about something like that?" "The night you were born was complicated, sweetheart." There were other families in Cedar Falls dealing with similar situations. The detectives think there might have been some kind of confusion. Emma stood up and walked to her window, looking out at the Colorado mountains that had been the backdrop of her entire conscious life. The peaks were touched with early snow, and the evening light made them look like something from a postcard or a dream. "Mom," she said, "are you telling me that I might have been kidnapped?" "No, honey, nothing like that. Everyone involved was trying to do what they thought was right. But there's a family in Iowa, people named Chen, who lost a baby daughter 18 years ago. A baby who was born the same night you were, in the same town." Emma felt the world tilt slightly, like a photograph being adjusted in a frame. "And you think I might be their daughter?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but the detectives want to run some DNA tests to find out for sure. And Emma, I want you to know that whatever we discover, it doesn't change how much I love you, or how grateful I am that you've been part of my life." Emma closed her eyes, feeling tears that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than sadness. A well of confusion and fear and love, all mixed together until she couldn't separate one emotion from another. "What happens if the tests show that I am their daughter?" she asked. "I don't know that either, but you're 18 now, which means you get to decide what happens next. Whatever you want to do, however you want to handle this, I'll support you completely." Emma thought about the family she had never known she might have, people who had spent 18 years wondering what happened to their baby girl. She thought about Patricia, who had raised her with such fierce devotion, despite carrying this enormous uncertainty. She thought about Rebecca, the ghost mother who had drifted through her childhood in stories and occasional birthday cards, and wondered if Rebecca even knew about any of this. "I want to take the tests," Emma said finally. "I need to know." "Are you sure, honey?" "I'm sure. But Mom, no matter what we find out, you're still my mom, okay? You're the one who taught me to ride a bike and helped me with homework, and stayed up with me when I had nightmares. That doesn't change." Patricia's relief was audible, even across the distance between them. "Thank you for saying that, sweetheart. It means everything to me." After they hung up, Emma sat in her dorm room as the Colorado evening deepened into night, thinking about all the ways a life could be built on foundations that weren't quite what they seemed. Her roommate returned from violin practice and found her sitting by the window, staring out at the mountains with an expression that seemed older than her 18 years. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, setting down her violin case with the careful movements of someone who recognized the signs of serious conversation. Emma turned to look at her roommate, coincidentally also named Sarah, which now seemed like a strange twist of fate, and tried to figure out how to explain what had just happened to her understanding of who she was. "I might have a different family than I thought I did," she said finally. "People I've never met who might have been looking for me my whole life." Sarah sat down on her own bed, facing Emma with the kind of patient attention that had made them good friends, despite knowing each other for only 2 months. "Do you want to talk about it?" Emma nodded, and found herself telling the story that Patricia had just shared with her. The night in Cedar Falls, the missing baby, the possibility that her entire identity might be built on a mistake that had affected multiple families for nearly 2 decades. As she spoke, the story seemed both completely unbelievable and absolutely inevitable, as if all the small details of her life that had never quite fit were finally clicking into place. "Wow," Sarah said when Emma finished. That's huge." "Yeah," Emma agreed. "And the weird thing is, part of me isn't even surprised. I always felt like there was something about my family's story that didn't quite make sense, like there were pieces missing from the puzzle." She thought about the way Patricia sometimes looked at her with an expression that contained equal parts love and sadness, as if she were seeing someone else's face in Emma's features. She thought about the fact that she had never resembled Rebecca in any of the photographs, and how Patricia had always deflected questions about Emma's father with vague references to someone who wasn't ready to be a parent. "What are you going to do?" Sarah asked. "Take the DNA test. Find out the truth." Emma looked out at the mountains again, their snow-covered peaks gleaming in the moonlight like beacons calling her toward something she couldn't yet name. "And then, I guess I'll have to decide what to do with that truth." Somewhere in Iowa, Margaret Hutchinson was probably sitting on her front porch, thinking about the night 18 years ago when she had delivered a baby into a situation that was more complicated than anyone had realized. Somewhere else, people named Chen were going about their Tuesday evening routine, not yet knowing that the daughter they had mourned for 18 years might be alive and well and studying to become a teacher. Emma Morrison closed her eyes and tried to imagine what it would be like to meet the people who might be her biological parents, to look into faces that might carry her own features, to discover a history that had been waiting for her all this time. The mountains outside her window stood silent and patient, holding their own secrets in the snow and stone, reminding her that some truths took time to emerge, and that the strongest foundations were often built from the most unexpected materials. The DNA results arrived on a Thursday morning in November, delivered to Detective Kowalski's office in an envelope that seemed far too small to contain the answer to 18 years of questions. Margaret had driven to the police station early, before the morning shift change, and she sat in the lobby watching officers begin their day with coffee and case files, while she waited for news that would reshape 3 families, understanding of their own histories. Ray emerged from his office with the envelope in his hand, and the expression of someone who had just read something that changed everything he thought he knew about a case. He nodded to Margaret, and together they walked to the small conference room where they had spent so many hours over the past month, plotting their search through archives and phone records and the complicated geography of secrets. "Before I open this," Ray said, settling into his chair across from Margaret, "I want you to know that whatever it says, you did the right thing by coming forward. No matter how this turns out, at least now we'll know the truth." Margaret nodded, her hands folded in her lap with the careful composure of someone who had spent a lifetime helping other people through moments that would define the rest of their lives. "Read it, Ray. Whatever it says, we'll figure out what comes next." Ray opened the envelope and pulled out a single sheet of official laboratory letterhead, covered with the kind of technical language that reduced the mystery of human identity to percentages and genetic markers. He scanned the document quickly, his expression shifting from neutral concentration to something that looked like amazement. "Margaret," he said quietly, "Emma Morrison is not Rebecca Morrison's biological daughter. The DNA shows no familial relationship between them whatsoever." Margaret felt her breath catch, even though this was the result they had all been expecting. Hearing it confirmed with scientific certainty made it real in a way that speculation couldn't achieve. And? She prompted. And Emma Morrison is the biological daughter of Sarah and David Chen. The DNA match is definitive, 97% probability of parentage. The words settled into the conference room like autumn snow, soft and quiet, but transforming everything they touched. Margaret thought about baby Emma's first cry in that rental house 18 years ago, about the yellow blanket Patricia had brought, about Rebecca's tears and the way she had turned away from her own child. None of them had known that they were participating in a story that began hours earlier in a hospital delivery room, with parents who had thought they were taking their daughter home only to discover her missing by morning. How did it happen, Ray? How does a baby disappear from one family and appear with another on the same night in a town the size of Cedar Falls? Ray was already reaching for another file folder, one he had been building as they traced the connections between the Morrison and Chen cases. I think I'm starting to understand that. Remember Patricia mentioned hearing a car in the driveway next door during Emma's birth? I went back and checked the address of the rental house where you delivered Emma. He pulled out a map of Cedar Falls with 2 addresses circled in red ink. 1247 Elm Creek Road, where Emma was born, and 1249 Elm Creek Road, right next door. Guess who was renting that house in October 1995? Margaret studied the map, seeing the proximity that had made everything possible. Someone connected to the Chen case? Rebecca Morrison. The real Rebecca Morrison, who was renting both houses under slightly different variations of her name. Rebecca L. Morrison at 1247 and R. L. Morrison at 1249. Same social security number on both lease applications, but apparently nobody caught the duplication at the time. The picture that emerged was more complex and deliberate than Margaret had imagined. Rebecca hadn't been a frightened teenager caught in an impossible situation. She had been someone with access to both babies, someone who had planned carefully enough to rent adjoining properties and coordinate events that would allow her to switch 2 newborns without anyone immediately realizing what had happened. But why? Margaret asked. What possible reason could she have had for taking the Chen baby and replacing her with another child? Ray turned the page in his file, revealing photocopied medical records and insurance documents that painted a picture of desperation and complicated family dynamics. Rebecca Morrison was listed as a nurse's aide at Cedar Falls General Hospital in 1995. She had access to patient information, including details about families who were expecting babies around the same time. Margaret felt a chill of understanding. She knew about the Chens. She knew they had struggled with infertility, knew how much they wanted that baby. And she also knew about Patricia's situation in Des Moines. Patricia Morrison was Rebecca's employer, not her aunt. She ran a private adoption agency that specialized in helping young mothers place their babies with families who couldn't have children naturally. Rebecca had been working for her for almost 2 years. The revelation recontextualized everything Margaret thought she had witnessed that October night. Patricia hadn't been a concerned relative helping a pregnant teenager. She had been a professional facilitator who specialized in making complicated family situations appear legal and legitimate. Rebecca hadn't been a scared young mother making desperate choices. She had been someone with the knowledge and access necessary to orchestrate a switch that would give the Chen baby to a family who desperately wanted a child, while ensuring that her own employer's business interests were protected. So Emma, the real Emma, the Chen's biological daughter, was supposed to go to Patricia for adoption placement. But instead of going to approved adoptive parents, Patricia kept her. That's what it looks like. And Rebecca's biological baby, assuming she really did give birth that night, went to the Chen family, who thought they were getting their own daughter back. Margaret closed her eyes, trying to process the implications of a deception that had been far more sophisticated than any of them had realized. Ray, if Rebecca's baby went to the Chens, where is she now? And where is Rebecca? Ray's expression grew grim. That's where the trail goes cold. The Chen family reported their baby missing the next morning, but they weren't reporting a kidnapping. They were reporting that their own daughter had disappeared from their home during the night. If someone switched babies at the hospital before the Chens ever took their real daughter home, they wouldn't have known to look for a different child. Margaret thought about Sarah Chen's photograph, the young mother holding a tiny pink dress with hope and grief written across her face. What happened to the baby the Chens raised? I don't know yet, but I think we're going to have to ask them. The conference room fell silent, as they contemplated the conversation they would need to have with a family who had spent 18 years believing their daughter was dead, only to learn that she was alive and well in Colorado, and that the child they had actually raised might not have been theirs at all. "Ray," Margaret said quietly, "we need to call Emma and Patricia before we talk to the Chens. They need to know what the DNA results say, and they need to decide how they want to handle this." Ray nodded, already reaching for his phone. "And then we need to find Rebecca Morrison, because I have a feeling she's the only one who knows the whole truth about what happened that night." Outside the conference room window, November snow was beginning to fall on Cedar Falls, covering the familiar streets with a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new. Margaret watched the snowflakes drift past the glass and thought about all the ways that truth could transform a landscape, making it recognizable and foreign at the same time, beautiful and treacherous depending on where you stood and how carefully you watched your step. In Colorado, Emma Morrison was about to learn that her identity was even more complicated than she had imagined. In Iowa, the Chen family was about to discover that their long grief might be ending just as a new kind of uncertainty began. And somewhere else, Margaret still didn't know where, Rebecca Morrison was living with the knowledge of what she had done 18 years ago, carrying secrets that were finally beginning to surface, like bones emerging from melting snow. The reunion took place on a Saturday afternoon in December, in the living room of Sarah and David Chen's farmhouse outside Cedar Falls, where 18 years of patient hope had been preserved like heirloom seeds, waiting for the right season to grow. Margaret arrived early, driving through snow-covered fields that stretched toward a horizon made soft by winter light, and found the house exactly as she had imagined it, modest and well-maintained, with the kind of careful beauty that comes from people who understand that love is often expressed through attention to small details. Sarah Chen met her at the front door, and Margaret was struck by how much older she looked than in the photographs from 1995, though her eyes still held the same quiet strength that had carried her through 18 years of unknowing. She was 43 now, with silver threading through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure. "Mrs. Hutchinson," Sarah said, extending her hand with a formality that seemed to contain multitudes of emotion held carefully in check. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for helping us understand what happened." David Chen appeared behind his wife, a tall man with gentle features and the kind of steady presence that suggested he had learned to be the anchor in a family that had weathered more storms than most. He wore a cardigan that looked hand-knitted and jeans that had been pressed for the occasion, and Margaret could see that he was nervous in the way that people are when they're about to meet someone who would change their understanding of their own story. "Please, come in," he said, taking Margaret's coat and hanging it in a closet that smelled faintly of cedar and old wool. "Emma should be here soon. Her flight from Denver landed about an hour ago." The living room was decorated for Christmas, with a tree in the corner that had been trimmed with ornaments that looked like they carried decades of family history. Margaret noticed that some of the decorations were clearly handmade, construction paper angels and popsicle stick stars that suggested other children had grown up in this house, creating the kind of artwork that parents save forever. "We have 2 other children," Sarah explained, following Margaret's gaze. "Michael is 25 now, married and living in Chicago. And Jenny is 16, at a friend's house this afternoon. We thought it would be better if Emma met us first before meeting her siblings." Margaret nodded, understanding the delicate choreography required for a moment like this. "How are you feeling about all of this?" Sarah and David exchanged a glance that contained the kind of communication that comes from 25 years of marriage and shared heartbreak. David reached for his wife's hand, and Margaret noticed that they both wore wedding rings that looked like they had been polished recently. "Terrified," Sarah said honestly. "Grateful, confused, happy. I've been preparing for this moment in my mind for 18 years, but now that it's actually happening, I don't know what to say to her." "You don't have to say anything special," Margaret said gently. "You just have to be yourselves. Emma is coming here because she wants to know who you are, not because she expects you to be perfect." David walked to the mantelpiece and picked up a photograph that showed a young woman with Asian features and a cap and gown, smiling at the camera with the kind of confidence that comes from earning something important through hard work. "This is Katie," he said, showing the photograph to Margaret. "The daughter we raised. She graduated from Iowa State last year with a degree in agricultural engineering. She's working in California now, helping develop sustainable farming practices." Margaret studied the photograph, seeing the family resemblance in Katie's features, and the pride in David's voice as he spoke about her accomplishments. "Does she know about Emma?" "We told her last week," Sarah said. She's struggling with it, honestly. She's always known she was adopted. We were open about that from the beginning, but learning that she might not be who we thought she was, that there might be another family somewhere looking for her, it's been hard." "Has she agreed to DNA testing?" "Eventually. She needs some time to process everything first. We're not pushing her. Whatever she decides, she'll always be our daughter." The sound of a car in the driveway interrupted their conversation, and Margaret felt her heart rate increase as she realized that Emma Chen, was about to walk through the door and meet the parent she had never known she had. Through the window, she could see a rental car parked behind her own vehicle, and a young woman getting out of the driver's seat, with the careful movements of someone who was gathering courage for something significant. Emma appeared on the front porch a moment later, visible through the glass panels that flanked the front door. She was taller than Margaret had expected, with dark hair that fell past her shoulders and Patricia's careful posture. She wore jeans and a Colorado State University sweatshirt, and she carried a small backpack that probably contained everything she thought she might need for a conversation that would reshape her understanding of where she came from. Sarah opened the door before Emma could knock, and the two women stood facing each other across the threshold with the kind of careful attention that people give to looking into a mirror for the first time. Margaret could see the recognition dawning in both their faces, not the immediate acknowledgement of shared features, but something deeper and more instinctive, as if some part of each of them had been waiting 18 years for this exact moment. "Emma," Sarah said quietly. "Mrs. Chen," Emma replied, and her voice carried the same careful formality that her birth mother had used with Margaret 20 minutes earlier. "Please, call me Sarah. And this is David, and we're so glad you're here." Emma stepped into the house and allowed David to take her coat, and Margaret watched as she looked around the living room with the kind of careful attention that people give to places that might hold clues about who they really are. Her gaze lingered on the Christmas tree, on the family photographs covering every surface, on the handmade decorations that spoke of years of celebration she had never been part of. "Your house is beautiful," Emma said, and Margaret could hear the nervousness in her voice despite her efforts to sound composed. "Thank you," David said. "Would you like some coffee? Or tea? Sarah made some cookies this morning, though I should warn you that baking isn't exactly her strongest skill." "Hey!" Sarah protested, but she was smiling, and Margaret could see some of the tension leaving her shoulders as the conversation found its footing in the familiar territory of gentle teasing and domestic hospitality. "Coffee would be great," Emma said, and she settled into the chair that Margaret had vacated, looking around the room with the kind of hungry attention that suggested she was trying to memorize everything she saw. As Sarah and David busied themselves in the kitchen, Emma turned to Margaret with an expression that mixed gratitude and uncertainty in equal measure. "Mrs. Hutchinson," she said, "I wanted to thank you for helping figure all this out. I know it must have been difficult to come forward after so many years." Margaret studied Emma's face, seeing traces of both her adoptive mother Patricia and her biological parents, but mostly seeing the young woman she had become through 18 years of love and careful nurturing, regardless of whose DNA had shaped her features. "Emma," she said, "I want you to know that the night you were born, everyone involved was trying to do what they thought was right. Your birth was complicated by circumstances that none of us fully understood at the time, but you were loved from the moment you took your first breath. That's never changed." Emma nodded, and Margaret could see tears gathering in her eyes despite her efforts to remain composed. "I keep thinking about how different everything could have been. If I had grown up here, with them, would I be a different person? Would I want different things, have different dreams?" "You might," Margaret said honestly. "But you might also be exactly who you're supposed to be, regardless of where you were raised. Sometimes I think we become ourselves in spite of our circumstances as much as because of them." Sarah and David returned with coffee and a plate of cookies that did indeed look like they had been made by someone whose talents lay elsewhere, and the four of them settled into the kind of careful conversation that happens when people are trying to bridge 18 years of separation with words that feel inadequate to the task. Emma told them about her life in Colorado, about Patricia's garden and her plans to become a teacher, about the mountains she had grown up seeing from her bedroom window, and the way Colorado snow was different from Iowa snow. Sarah and David told her about the farm, about her siblings Michael and Jenny, about the way they had kept her room ready for 18 years just in case she ever came home. "There's something else," David said as the afternoon light began to fade outside the windows. "Something we want to show you." He left the room and returned with a wooden box that looked like it had been polished regularly over the years. Inside, carefully preserved in tissue paper, was a tiny pink dress, the same one Sarah had been holding in the photograph Detective Kowalski had shown Margaret weeks earlier. "I bought this the day before you were born," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I had convinced myself that you were going to be a girl, even though the ultrasound wasn't clear. When you disappeared, I couldn't bring myself to return it or give it away. I kept thinking that someday you would come home, and I would finally get to see you wear it." Emma reached out to touch the dress with fingers that trembled slightly, and Margaret could see her trying to imagine the young mother who had purchased this tiny garment with such hope and love, never knowing that she would have to wait 18 years to share it with her daughter. "It's beautiful," Emma said softly, "but I think I'm probably too big for it now." The laughter that followed was the kind that comes from relief and recognition, and the sudden understanding that some kinds of love are strong enough to survive almost anything. Margaret watched as Sarah and David and Emma began to discover the rhythms of conversation that would allow them to build a relationship based on who they were now, rather than who they might have been if the past had unfolded differently. As the evening deepened and the conversation turned to plans for future visits and phone calls, and the slow work of getting to know each other, Margaret found herself thinking about all the ways that families could be constructed and reconstructed, broken apart and carefully repaired. Emma would always be Patricia Morrison's daughter in all the ways that mattered most, but she was also Sarah and David Chen's daughter in ways that DNA could confirm, but that love would have to establish over time. Patricia arrived the next morning, driving through the Iowa snow to meet the people who had given birth to the daughter she had raised. Margaret watched from Sarah's kitchen window as the two mothers stood in the front yard, talking with the kind of careful attention that suggested they were working out the details of shared custody over a heart that had room for multiple families. Emma stood between them, no longer the missing baby from 1995 or the foundling who had been raised by strangers, but a young woman who had been shaped by 18 years of love and attention and was now ready to embrace the complicated truth of where she had come from and who she was meant to become. The story that had begun with Margaret's phone call on an October night 18 years earlier was finally finding its resolution, not in the tidy ending of a fairy tale, but in the messier, more beautiful reality of people who were willing to make room in their lives for unexpected grace and the kind of love that was strong enough to transcend the circumstances of its origin. If stories like Emma's move you to believe in the power of hope and the strength of human connection, we share them because they remind us that even in our darkest moments, the melodies of love continue to play, waiting to guide us home. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to hear more stories that touch the soul and inspire the heart.